is going to be an agenda slide. And fundamentally, you don't need to see the details here, but what you need to understand is we're going to go sort of from the top of the funnel all the way down at the bottom to sort of what a bottoms-up model for data center load forecasting looks like and whether or not that should or is the gold standard, but wanting to walk this group through the different layers of planning and forecasting that is going on right now. I think one of the spoilers is going to be we are in the Wild West. They're state of the art, but really what I want to talk about here is state of the industry and sort of where different practices are being played out and give you guys some flavor of testimony in this space, all the way to sort of all the white papers that are populating the space and how to be a powerful consumer of a lot of information. So we can move to the next slide. Here, what I wanted to just do is sort of add a couple bullet points to the key references that were shared out about a week ago. I know everyone has read all of these, but if you happen to not have, what I would say is sort of two things I wanted to spend doing here. One is, if you literally just have time to read one document, it would be this grid strategies document, this first document in the background. The work here, particularly by John Wilson, is excellent. And if you literally just have time to read one thing, this will get you very far. Now, for those of you who have read everything, there's a little nugget in the sector-specific analysis under after the LBNL paper, which we're going to talk about, which I know some of you have seen before. The want to go deeper, if you are really looking to understand sort of the deepest parts of how data center modeling is done and how to really think about it, there's three links. Really four links in this section that will get you very sharp, very quick, well, not very quickly because there's some long articles here, but it will get your hands sort of really into how sort of the most cutting edge thought is done on this space. So I wanted to just highlight those two things, but now we can sort of move on to the next slide, which is designed to give us sort of an overlay of all the different types of large loads. And what you're going to see in this slide, as you see sort of as Chris did and as I'm going to do, is I'm trying to sprinkle out all sorts of resources for folks to go, high quality resources that get you continually sort of grounded in more and more data and more approaches about how to think about this space. This is a great piece by RMI, where they've sort of given us some key dimensions for all of these big loads. The first three that you see on this list are related to EVs. Chris did a great job talking about that. Chris is an expert in this. The next two are ones that I've highlighted here, which are really around data centers and manufacturing. A little bit of a spoiler alert. We're going to spend more of our time talking about data centers than we are manufacturing. We are going to give that some treatment, but in the interest of time, we're really going to go into data centers. But fundamentally, why are we doing that? Because these are, and this is the third bullet, data centers are sort of on an individual basis, much larger than anything else out there right now, and that continues to look to be the case going into the future. They are far more dispersed across the country. They're not quite as targeted. And the sort of total load that we're talking about is just quite enormous. So this is where we're going to spend a good amount of our time today. We can move on to the next slide. So I think, I believe many in this group have seen some of this information, but I don't know if everyone has, and it's worthwhile talking about some of the load projections that we're seeing for data center growth. This is out of a Berkeley Lab report that was done in December. It is an excellent piece of work. It's linked here. It's also one of the reference documents, and it shows us just how wide the sort of bounds of data center growth are. And I think it's important for us to sort of really understand sort of what is underpinning the range of growth, and to understand that even at the low end of this growth, we are talking about something that is extremely material. In this graphic, sort of looking just 3 short years out, the data center loads could be upwards of 6.7% of all US energy usage, which is remarkable. The next image here is also from the LBNL report. As I note here, I have edited this. It's a much longer graphic. I have cut it down so it fits on this slide. But what this is designed to show you is that all of these really intelligent people at these really important organizations are coming up with a whole range of scenarios in terms of the bands around what we could see on load growth. And I think as sort of intelligent consumers, we are immediately skeptical of what is going on if we're seeing these types of spans of load projections. And this next slide sort of gets at what sort of underpins that range of uncertainty and the bands. So there's 4 slides here, or 4 images that lead to sort of what's happening. This first top left slide gets at something that's super important to understand, and we're gonna come back to this concept. This is all material from Berkeley Labs report from December, which is that if we're looking at that top left tile, you'll see some red and orange lines, and then on the next you'll see some blue-green lines. What they're differentiating between is sort of fundamentally different generations of compute processing power. And what you'll see as you look carefully at that is that one, sort of the axis on one only goes up to about 1.4 watts. The axis on the other goes much higher, 6 watts. What's happening is as we move to this new generation of graphical processing units, sort of NVIDIA's chips, the chips that run these data centers, we are seeing fundamentally much larger consumption of energy. So the unit of compute is far more energy hungry than it used to be. That's one thing that's going on. And you can start to see some of these bands around this unit for forecasting how much energy they're going to use is quite wide. Next, we see that underneath that, we see that the utilization for these servers is increasing quite a bit compared to how servers used to be used. In sort of the pinkish red at the top, this is AI training. So when we're running a big, large language model, we spend a huge amount of time in training. It's a sort of north of 80% in terms of sort of just flat peaking load that's running all the time. And then down below that, sort of in purple, you see that inference, and you're seeing that that's a little bit less sort of utilization, but those are markedly higher than what we've seen sort of historically. The third thing we're going to see, now we're on the right side, upper panel, is that fundamentally the number of this is sort of the installed servers. Think of this as the number of chips. We're going to focus on sort of the 2028 number in the blue, compared to the graphic sort of on the right side of that. You'll see the amount of sort of chips, these GPUs, are just substantially higher than they have been historically. And that all leads us to what you'll see in this bottom graphic, which shows energy and shows you just how much energy and the bounds around that energy and the component. Now you've seen the component parts that lead to these bounds of what's associated with these new generation of chips and these new servers. And I think so. I've spent quite a bit of time here because I think if folks understand some of these constituent parts, they start to understand a little bit more about what's going on with sort of the underpinnings of how these forecasts are produced. We can now go on to the next slide, where we're going to zoom back out and sort of look at a couple things, which is one, sort of location. These things are not happening uniformly across the country. This is much like EVs. It's happening sort of in the coastal areas and in Texas in this case. And so, depending on your jurisdiction, you need to think about this obviously sort of very differently if you're perhaps in Idaho versus, Virginia. And I know we have some folks from Virginia, and, these folks have been at this for years and years and years. And this will be something we sort of talk about later, is this sort of collaboration with folks who have dealt with this for years and years and years is something that, we can really leverage to be smarter and better about how we evolve and practices. The next thing I want to talk about is on the left side of this, or excuse me, the right side of this slide, where we saw in the previous slide different types of chips and how differently the amount of that impacts how they think about load. It impacts how they model it. Then there's hyperscalers. So I think everyone's probably heard that term, just to sort of ground everyone. When we talk about Amazon, we're talking about Microsoft. So these sort of four, and there's more, but massive tech companies that are building out huge infrastructure. Then the last one is leased, which is often referred to as co-location. And this is not co-location of load and gen. That's another type of co-location. When we talk about co-location, we're talking about rented space where you have 1,000 server racks that are leased out to different enterprises, whether that be Visa or MasterCard or whoever else. And so the server is actually used by a bunch of different folks. And so we do have this different constellation of different data type, different sort of data center types. That again matters for how we're forecasting these things. We can move on to the next slide now. This is going to be my slide on the treatment related to sort of onshoring. And I want to just sort of talk about what's happening in onshoring, how to think about onshoring. And where I'm focusing here is on sort of EV and battery manufacturing. That is, as you can see in the table on the right, we've got the different types of onshoring of manufacturing in the columns. And you can see sort of, as I've highlighted, EV and battery manufacturing is over half of what we're seeing in this space. A couple caveats with this is that this information was generated in 2023. That feels like a lifetime ago, and in some ways it is. We know that the policy environment is changing quite substantially with tariffs and other policies that are coming out. And so this is, I think, an area that we need to be watching and be very careful of. And I think part of what I also wanted to reflect on is that we see that the total here is about 1.6 gigawatts. That load relative to what we're seeing in sort of data center loads is shockingly like relatively small. And that's not because these loads aren't small or small. It's because the data center loads are huge. Some recent industry publications I saw from the banks indicate that there is somewhere on the order of 170 gigawatts of high quality, meaning more or less likely data center load sort of in queues across the country. So the order of magnitudes here are just tremendously different. We are seeing a lot here, but I think in terms of our focus today, due to time, we're going to spend more time on the data centers. So we can go to the next slide now, where we're going to start looking at ISO and RTO forecasting approaches. What we're looking at here is sort of a cartoonish version provided by these two entities from ERCOT on the left and PJM on the right. And the point here is really that sort of conceptually, what ISOs and RTOs are doing is similar-ish. They are taking sort of existing loads. They are removing out, in PJM's case, sort of existing data center loads so that they get a new net forecast, and they're adding back in data center loads to get to a final forecast. But at a high level, they're running sort of, I think, conceptually similar processes. But as I sort of say in the header, not within the control of the RTO's control, and this this that they note in their published works is that they don't have a huge amount of like detail into how those loads were generated or the underpinning assumptions that feed underneath them. They take those and they incorporate them into their forecasts as they're supposed to do, but they really don't have all sort of the working pieces of what underpins what that load should be. That's slightly different from what occurs at PJM, where they require the population of this detailed data template that has many of the aspects that I've sort of bulleted out in this call out, including like hourly load shape estimations for the data centers. This is all, again, these are assumption based to Chris's whole point, garbage in, garbage out. But the things that these entities are using to develop their forecasts are different due to different rules and different approaches to these issues. In the next slide, we're going to look at 4 examples from RTOs and how they derate different approaches to derating the estimates of load that they are receiving from transmission operators or the utilities who are helping populate these forecasts. So we have ERCOT, which actually sort of gives 2 haircuts to the numbers they receive. It amounts to, it's about a 50% haircut with another 50-ish 5% haircut. That is based on analysis that they have done historically to sort of derate what they are seeing in terms of the demand request versus the capacity request versus what they've historically seen coming through demand once they interconnect and start operating these data centers. MISO trims it to sort of about 20 to 25 to 40%. PJM makes another haircut, not quite as big as some of these others. And here you see sort of the bottom, the CEC's work related to how the different utilities, in this instance, PG&E and SCE, are sort of thinking about probabilistically how they derate what they are seeing on their side. Next, we can sort of, I know we've just got about 3 minutes to move through to get to sort of our core. We can move through these 2 slides fairly quickly. The point here is that EPRI ran some surveys of about 25 utilities to get a sense of what is the state of the industry on data center forecasting. And you can see in this first bullet, like, the news here is that there is no real consensus among these entities. They all are seeing a lot of speculation. This is why you are seeing people sort of look at the past, see what actually showed up, think about what their rules of thumb are on derating, and apply that here. The next slide is more information out of that EPRI research that again shows that there is a lot of different approaches to how utilities are derating or sort of adjusting their forecasts. And in this next slide, we're going to get 3 examples that I think give you a range of how utilities are approaching this. On the left, we sort of look at I think a more sophisticated approach, but of the 3, a more straightforward approach where you have a customer provided load. Then what they've done is they generate this sort of matrix score, which basically includes, and I've listed this here in the bullet, several factors that they sort of rate as ways to sort of to modify what they think that customer load will be. They combine those, and in this case, they sort of reduce the requested load by about 68%. The next example is a more sort of statistically driven, sort of Monte Carlo simulation based approach, where they are taking into account their seeding it with a capacity request. Then they're looking at what do we think the likelihood is that this will actually connect, and what do we think the magnitude, that's the 30% sort of this load will actually be. It won't be the 100, it will be something we think less than that. But they give themselves sort of a statistically generated normal distribution of outcomes, and then they pick that. Then you have what Dominion is doing, which, and again, I know there's some regulators here who have probably been involved in this, but I would say is the most comprehensive approach. And there's a couple reasons for why I think Dominion is able to take the approach they have. One is, as folks may know, Dominion service territory, particularly Loudoun County, is the sort of global hub of sort of hyperscalers and advanced data centers sort of in the AI space globally, so they have a lot of experience doing this. But what I like about what they've done is they show what their historic forecasts have been, they show what the actuals were, they show the delta. They also use a combination of statistical modeling and importantly, customer intelligence through interviews and confidential information is gathered through that and informs their process. Though I know we're at time, so I'm just going to refer to this last slide very quickly, which is a snapshot of sort of what I think is the state of the art in terms of developing sort of the groundwork for a bottoms up, hyper detailed sort of tool for forecasting data center loads. I think the question is whether or not, and this comes directly out of the Berkeley Labs work, is this feasible for everyone to develop on their own? I think the answer is no, but I think it sets a really clear sense of what things underpin these forecasts, and that enables us to ask tougher questions or better questions about them. So with that, I'll close up.
Great. Thank you so much, Greg. That was wonderful. And sorry to cut you short
No.
at the end, but if there's specific questions, then we could get to that.